Hi everyone, this chapter is chapter 24 and it talks about the age of jazz, which to me is one of the more interesting parts of US history. Maybe it's because, we've seen movies where we have seen flappers and, a lot of you guys may have even dressed as a flapper for Halloween. Anyway, there's something about that culture and I love the music from the era. So looking forward to sharing these notes with you. And we'll start with this illustration that is actually illustrations for F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tales of the Jazz Age, which were drawn by John Held Jr., and it just showed how carefree this time really was. We'll talk a little more about F. Scott Fitzgerald a little later in the chapter. Again, here's your chronology. We ended chapter 23 with the election of Warren G. Harding, so naturally we pick up with it here. Harding is president during this time until Hoover is elected president in 1928. Okay, let's get started. Movies were a big deal at this time. With economic prosperity, people had money to blow, and they did that a number of different ways. One of those was going to the movies. Going to the movies was so common that most people went at least once a week. 25 cents could get you a double feature plus a live show. Now, today, double feature, let's see, if you go at a matinee, and if it's not a 3D movie, you could probably get out for maybe $10. So a double feature would then be 20. And gee, we can't even add the cost of a live show. That's not even a thing today. So anyway, it was a great deal. And these people, like I said, went to the movie at least once a week. In 1927, movies changed because they became audible. They had the first talkie. The Jazz Singer was that first talking movie, and it starred Al Jolson. And I think it's interesting to note here that, because our college is located in Malvern, a lot of these little factoids that I throw your way are Malvern related. But Malvern used to have an outdoor movie theater, not a drive-in movie theater, because people would actually walk up and go in and sit down, like on the lawn or something like that. It was downtown on Main Street, and there was a piano up front. So for the silent movies that used to play in the 20s, people would go sit, and there was a pianist on site who would play with the movie so that people would read the subtitles or the little cues that went throughout the movie to let you know the action of the movie, since they weren't yet talking movies. I thought that was really cool. Anyway, early film production was based in New York. The reason it moved to California was to get away from the high equipment costs that were in New York. So the first movie shot in Hollywood was shot in 1910, and it was called In Old California. After that, Hollywood became a moving picture headquarters. And the image here is Charlie Chaplin, who was a famous silent movie actor. And this is a scene from The Kid, which starred Jackie Coogan in the title role of The Kid. Also important to this new culture was the new transportation that was available. Now, there had been automobiles around for a while, but they were expensive. So the ability to mass produce automobiles made them cheaper and more affordable for the general public. Auto inventors, the Duryea brothers in Massachusetts, the Daimler and Benz in Germany were the auto inventors. Henry Ford just made it cheaper. He's the one who pulled them into assembly line manufacturing. And because of that, a typical car dropped from $850 in 1908 to $300 in 1924. That meant you could buy a decent used vehicle for $5 back in the day. That meant that students could drive. College students were driving more. It wasn't just for the rich. Everyone could drive at that price. By 1929, there were 23 million automobiles in the United States. And this image is a picture of an advertisement for Ford's Model T from the New Orleans Times-Picayune in 1911. And notice that at this point, the prices were still high. They weren't as high as $850, but they were still up there. And this is an image from a 1928 Literary Digest interview with Henry Ford. It shows workers on his assembly line as they produce new models of Ford automobiles. So Ford's assembly line was important. It drove prices down, like I said, from $850 for a car to $300. That gave people freedom to travel. It gave them the opportunity to socialize and to broaden their culture. It also, for the workers there, created a standard 8-hour workday and higher wages. Ford did that to negotiate with the employees, whom he told them that they could not unionize. So in exchange for them not being allowed to create a union, he gave them better work hours and higher wages. Additionally, something else that Ford did that not everyone was doing at the time, he paid all workers the same regardless of race. The cons of this was that assembly line work was monotonous, it was very repetitive, and because of that, people got really tired of it. So there was a lot of turnover there. And as I've already mentioned, he wouldn't allow workers to unionize. And that high turnover rate meant that he was always, training someone new to take the job. Travel by air was also important at this time. Now, people had been flying for a while, but the important thing in this era was that Charles Lindbergh, who's in the picture labeled A here, flew the first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. He flew from New York to Paris in 33 hours. And just to show you that flying wasn't just for white males at the time, we have Bessie Coleman, who was an African-American woman stunt pilot who had been flying at this time for about 20 years. So from the early 1900s into the 1920s, she was a popular stunt pilot. There were more cultural changes too. Electricity was widespread. That meant there were household appliances like washers and vacuum cleaners and refrigerators. Every home just about had a radio or a phonograph. So a phonograph would be a record player, if you know what that is. So people my age grew up with record players, but I know that not everyone has seen one of those. So anyway, a phonograph is a record player. It also, because electricity was widespread and there were more household appliances, stores needed to get those goods into the hands of consumers. And they did that by creating store credit and installment plans. GE was one of the first to do that. And they're still in business today, so it worked out well for them. Also, advertising begins to grow as a career. And, with products, they try to find ways to sell them, and print advertising and radio advertising becomes very lucrative in terms of careers. That stimulates a growth in publishing, which also stimulates a growth in literacy. Two of the popular magazines of the time were Ladies' Home Journal and the Saturday Evening Post, because they connected the middle-class consumer with advertisers. And this advertisement for Palmolive soap was for Ladies' Home Journal in 1922. Let's go back to media now. In the 1920s, the radio was important. It brought sports into every home. Everyone had a radio. Broadcast news developed at this time. Serial stories developed. Serial in the way of continuing sagas, sort of like we would think of soap operas today, or stories that would build upon each other, not necessarily a sitcom kind of thing. It was also important for political speeches. And the radio was great because it didn't require literacy. Now, while literacy is important to a growing nation, the fact that it didn't require literacy meant that people of all ages could get messages from advertisers. And as I just mentioned, advertising was growing here, so it was very important. They could target audiences of all ages through radio. It also smoothed differences across the country in dialect. We all have different accents and different language idiosyncrasies based on our location, regional dialects. And radio gave us a chance to smooth that out. And by doing that, it kind of gave us this united speech without a regional dialect. It also promoted, however, racial stereotypes with shows like Amos and Andy that aired coast to coast. So while since we're in the South, we tend to think a lot about racial stereotypes associated with the South, it's not true, it's not accurate to limit it to just the South. Those racial stereotypes were everywhere, and radio did not help that. This is a picture of Babe Ruth, picture A. He led the New York Yankees to 4 World Series championships. And in this 1921 picture, he's actually standing outside the New York Yankees dugout. Picture B is of Helen Willis, who was a tennis player, popular at the time. She won a total of 31 Grand Slam titles in her career, including 8 single titles at Wimbledon. Nativism was a concept that grew in popularity at this time. Nativism favors white Americans with long family ties to the United States over recent immigrants. It's a type of nationalism. Fear and anxiety was rampant over the increased amount of immigrants that were arriving in our country. So that kind of fed this concept of nativism. The Emergency Immigration Act of 1921 actually limited the number of European immigrants that could come into the United States for the first time in history. It limited immigration to 3% of the residents from their country in the 1910 census. So just to clarify, by checking the 1910 census to see, I don't know, let's say Russia, for example, by checking the 1910 American census for the total number of Russians in our country, we limited immigration to 3% of that total number. So it would have been low. Then in 1924, the National Origins Act dropped that even more. It dropped that quota to 2% of the 1890 census. So they went back to a time before immigration had become popular to the United States, 1890, and then dropped that quota by 2%. This National Origins Act was supported by both labor unions and the KKK. It was supported by the labor unions to preserve jobs for Americans, and it was supported by the KKK because of their beliefs in white superiority. Speaking of the KKK, the 1950 movie The Birth of a Nation reignited KKK interest. It's this racist movie that centers around a white viewpoint of post-Civil War Reconstruction. The Klan began an active recruitment in the 1920s, and membership grew tremendously. This time period is actually known as the Second Ku Klux Klan. The first, obviously, would have been during Civil War Reconstruction. Membership during the Second Ku Klux Klan grew to 6 million members. The KKK was against Catholics, Jews, African Americans, and immigration, period. Also at this time, an organization called Women of the KKK began. And the women of this group were for prohibition, for getting rid of alcohol, and they gave out Bibles to school children. So mostly they publicly abstained from violence. But they did rely on violence, intimidation, and terror to still perpetuate their beliefs. Thankfully, the movement began to dwindle because of some anti-masking legislation and public scandals, violence, and murder. Masking was very important to the KKK, so this anti-masking legislation that forbid it helped end that movement quickly. Not quick enough. And this is a 1921 picture from the Denver News where 3 Klan members, 2 women and 1 man, stand in front of a burning cross. So women were also allowed to participate in these rituals like the burning cross. The Klan locally, I think this is really interesting to keep into perspective. We read all of these things about the Klan. It's important to know that historically, we had a Klan in Malvern. The Klan chapter was developed in Malvern on January 31st, 1922. This is actually a picture of the charter that I got to see in a flea market in Hot Springs. So anyway, this charter was signed 1922, January 31st. The leader of the local Klan chapter was S.E. Henry. Now there is an S.E. Henry that is listed as a former county judge. I have not yet coordinated to see if those timelines line up to see if he was county judge at the time that he helped charter this Klan chapter. So Malvern's Klan chapter was chartered officially January 31st, 1922. On February 2nd, 1922, just a couple of days later, an African American named John Harris was actually lynched in Malvern by 200 mask-wearing men for allegedly harassing white women and girls with lewd comments. So I think it's important to keep that into perspective. We talk about the Klan. It's important to know that these things were happening locally as well as nationwide. Something else that was going on at the time, we still hear about it today, is this argument, creation versus evolution. And it began in the 1920s with something called the Butler Act. And the Butler Act leads us to this imagery of a city mouse versus the country mouse. You guys know that story. So as cities became the center of opportunity, rural people began to see them as sinful. All those loose women were in the city, and people weren't family oriented in the city, that sort of thing. Urbanites, however, saw these country folk as hayseeds and lagging behind. So we have this city mouse versus country mouse, which ends up being creation versus evolution. So the Butler Act made it illegal in Tennessee to teach evolution in public schools. Only the concept of divine creation was allowed. So the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, wanted to challenge that case. Dayton, Tennessee, who had lost about a third of its population, said, yeah, bring it. Let's do the trial here. They knew that it would garner attention for their community, so they wanted to promote their town. There was a guy named John Scopes who had been a substitute teacher, and he said that he might have taught evolution when he filled in as a biology substitute teacher. So he was the one that the ACLU was going to represent. The media billed this as the Scopes monkey trial. The monkey reference there references to the idea of Darwinism, the idea that evolution, human evolved from, apes. So anyway, the Scopes monkey trial. Scopes was actually found guilty. Because he admitted that he'd taught evolution, he was fined $100. So this perpetuated the whole city versus country divide at this time. Evolutionists thought that the prosecutor was foolish. Creationists felt like their religion was under attack. So nothing was really solved here. It just really perpetuated that whole ideology of the city mouse and the country mouse, that the cities were sinful and the country people were backward. The 20s also brought about this new morality. And this image of the flapper on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. So young people were more permissive and liberal than their parents. Flappers were female party girls, like in the image that we saw on the previous slide. They wore short skirts, they had short hair, they wore makeup, they drank and smoked with the boys, and so flappers were really party girls. Now, the party guys were known as sheiks. That term has lost its usage. We don't say that very much now. If you hear people talk about the 20s, you usually hear flappers, but you don't usually hear sheik. College-age students were holding necking or petting parties based on the idea of Freud and Ellis's idea that sex is pleasurable for humans. So we have this kind of sexual revolution taking hold. Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, began introducing a campaign about birth control that gave women more opportunity then to control their futures. Also, private spaces offered by cars. I think this is funny, really. Private spaces offered by cars and birth control equals more sex by unmarried people at this time. So we have young people experimenting a little bit more than in the past because they have, one, privacy, and two, they have birth control. So the party music of the era was jazz music. It was this combination of blues and ragtime that started in African American clubs in New Orleans, Chicago, and New York, and then it just spread like wildfire nationwide. The Cotton Club in New York became huge. It was actually owned by gangster Oni Madden, who later moved to Springs and owned the Southern Club, which is the picture is up. So I want to switch over now to share my screen to show you some of the music from that era. This is going to be, now this is actually filmed in the 30s, but it's the Cotton Club and two popular dancers there. Okay, I'll stop it there. I want to point out that the performers there are all African American. The thing about the Cotton Club was that it promoted the careers of African American musicians, dancers, and entertainers. However, African Americans were not allowed to be customers in the club. So I think that's really ironic. Something else that they did, they sought out light-skinned African Americans, and they felt like that would be more palatable to an all-white audience. So obviously very much discriminatory in that regard, while still promoting the careers of African American entertainers and musicians. So I want to show you this too, dance crazes from the 1920s. The Charleston was a big one. The Lindy Hop was also popular. So you notice the Charleston could be done singularly. The Lindy Hop is a doubles dance, couples dance. The jump and jive, also a singles dance. Jitterbug. Balboa. And the tango. And tap dance was very popular. Quick step. The cakewalk. We'll go back to sharing those slides now. So we were talking about party music, and like I mentioned, one of the things about the party music of that time frame was that as popular as the Cotton Club was, to really propel African Americans into music and the entertainment industry, it was so ironic that African Americans were not allowed to visit the club, only to perform in it. All right, so now we're moving on to talk about the women. The change in dress and social mores was part of the women's rights movement. The 19th Amendment actually gave women the right to vote, and all of these social changes was really kind of indicative of them flexing their political power and experimenting outside of what had been their social norms. The Promotion of the Welfare and Hygiene of Maternity and Infancy Act of 1921 actually gave $1.25 million for well baby clinics and educational programs like nursing. So women became more educated about how to care for their children and also to enter rooms like nursing. Alice Paul at this time drafted an Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, but it was just as the progressive movement was coming to a close and finally losing its steam. So nothing really happened to it until 1972 when it passed. The period also created a new African American experience. The Great Migration occurred during this time. That's when African Americans left the South for jobs and opportunity in the North. Now, that included jobs at the Ford factories. That does not mean that African Americans escaped segregation or discrimination from the South when they moved north. It still existed there. As a matter of fact, there it was kind of like de facto segregation, which means separated by fact or practice rather than by law. So as African Americans moved to the north, they still moved into segregated neighborhoods, and these segregated neighborhoods were already full, so they became packed. And Harlem at that point really became a draw. It became the center for Afrocentric art, music, poetry, and politics, and led to the Harlem Renaissance, this rediscovery of Black culture and racial pride, which led to African American nationalism. W.E.B. Du Bois rejected white nationalism and encouraged African Americans to work together to elevate Black literature and cultural expansion. He also embraced Africa as the true homeland for African Americans, which is called Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey was also important during this time. He promoted the Back to Africa movement, actually wanted African Americans to move back to Africa, which is ironic because many of these people had never been to Africa. So he's talking about going to a cultural homeland. He founded the Black Star Steamship Line and the United Negro Improvement Association. He also, in that United Negro Improvement Association, identified light skin as a sign of inferiority. So Garvey is promoting dark skin African nationalism. He was eventually arrested for mail fraud and deported, but his legacy remained for people like Malcolm X and the entire Black Power movement that would come along 40 years later in the 1960s. And this is a picture of Jamaican-born poet and novelist Claude McKay, who articulated the new sense of self and urban community of African Americans during the Harlem Renaissance. Prohibition came about in this time period. So the 18th Amendment, which was passed in 1919, actually banned making, selling, or transporting liquor, but it was bootlegged, which means smuggled. This whole prohibition thing was hard to enforce. It led to the creation of speakeasies, which are these clubs that secretly sold liquor. And organized crime boomed at this time because they were bootlegging. Al Capone was a Chicago bootlegger who, expanded from bootlegging to include illegal activities such as prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, and murder. And he earned more than $100 million a year in his organized crime scheme. So picture A shows that liquor was confiscated when it could be and discarded when they could find it. The key words there are when it could be and when they could find it. Consumers found lots of different ways to smuggle and hide liquor during Prohibition. So in this picture, picture B below, she's got a cane with her, and that cane actually served as a flask. So, it was hollowed and liquor was in the cane. Genius. Also at this time, we have these writers who come about that are known as the lost generation. They're these young intellectuals of the 1920s. So the 1920s are all about the big party, right? We have the flappers, we have the sheiks, we have the music that really draws people to party. We have these young intellectuals who are thinking, not much fun in thinking. So they feel like they're lost in this time period. Many of them moved out of the country. They became expatriates or expats, which just basically means it's a person who lives outside their native country. Paris was a very popular place for these expats to go. Lost generation writers include F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. Also Ernest Hemingway, who is pictured here. One of his famous books is A Farewell to Arms. There are many others. Sinclair Lewis is also part of this lost generation. He satirized the American middle class. And Elizabeth Wharton, also, who wrote about old society, old New York society. That wraps up our slides for Chapter 24, the Jazz Age. So now you have everything you need to know about the Roaring Twenties.